People only show you who they really are when they think you have no power. The rain had just started falling over Westport, Connecticut, turning the long stone driveway of the Hawthorne mansion slick beneath the golden lights lining the entrance, and one by one, black SUVs rolled through the iron gates carrying guests dressed in tuxedos and silk gowns worth more than most people's monthly rent, while valet attendants hurried through the cold night air holding umbrellas over wealthy couples laughing their way toward the charity gala inside. But 40 feet away from the red carpet, a yellow taxi stopped near the curb, its engine rattling softly before the back door opened, and a black woman stepped out slowly with a small brown suitcase in one hand and a folded wool coat draped over her arm, her shoes damp from the rain before they even touched the pavement. And the moment Naomi Carter looked up at the mansion, her eyes softened in a way nobody around her understood, because to everyone else it was just another billionaire estate glowing under crystal lights. But to her, it was the last place her mother had ever called home, the last place she had laughed, prayed, and taken her final breath 3 months earlier upstairs beside the east-facing windows overlooking the lake. And for half a second Naomi simply stood there listening to the sound of rain tapping against the hedges as memories hit her harder than the cold air ever could, until the sharp voice of a security guard sliced through the moment like a knife. "Ma'am, service deliveries go around back." Naomi turned calmly toward the front gate, where 2 guards stood beneath the covered security booth wearing dark gray uniforms with silver badges reflecting the light, and the taller one, a white man in his late 40s with a stiff jaw and military posture, stepped forward with the confidence of someone used to deciding who belonged and who didn't. His name tag read Daniel Brooks. He barely glanced at Naomi's face before looking down at her suitcase, then at the taxi still idling behind her. "The gala entrance is private tonight," he said flatly. "Guests arrive through the main list only." Naomi tightened her fingers around the handle of her suitcase. "I'm not here for the gala," she answered quietly. "I live here." For one long second the rain seemed louder than everything else. Then one of the younger guards snorted under his breath, and Daniel let out a dry laugh that carried just enough volume for nearby guests to hear it too. A white couple walking toward the entrance slowed slightly, curious now, the woman hiding a smile behind her champagne-colored glove. Daniel folded his arms. "You live here?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." Daniel looked over her shoulder toward the taxi driver like he was waiting for the punchline. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice into something colder, "this property belongs to the Hawthorne family." Naomi's eyes moved back to the mansion, to the giant windows glowing amber against the stormy sky. "I know," she replied softly. "That's why I'm here." Another SUV rolled through the gate behind her, headlights washing over the wet pavement, and Daniel stepped closer, lowering one hand toward the holster clipped at his belt. Not threatening, just controlling, practiced, territorial. "Listen carefully," he said. "Tonight isn't the night to make a scene. So either head to the employee entrance or call whoever hired you." Naomi looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not embarrassed, just tired in a way that comes from carrying grief too long without letting anyone see it. Rainwater slid down the sleeve of her coat as she answered. "Nobody hired me." Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "Then you need to leave." Behind the iron gates, music drifted faintly through the cold air while wealthy guests disappeared into warmth and crystal light without ever noticing the woman standing alone outside in the rain. The woman whose name was already written into every deed, every legal document, every inch of the estate beneath their feet, even though nobody there had bothered to ask who she was before deciding exactly where they believed she belonged. Naomi could still hear the laughter behind her even after the next group of guests disappeared through the mansion doors, their polished shoes clicking across marble floors while warm music spilled faintly into the rainy night like a world she was apparently never meant to enter again. And for a moment, she simply stood there at the edge of the driveway with rain collecting along the collar of her coat, staring at the giant stone house that had once felt smaller when she was a little girl racing barefoot down those same steps every Christmas morning beside the woman who raised her. Because 20 years earlier nobody at Hawthorne Mansion had cared what Naomi Carter looked like when Eleanor Hawthorne took her hand for the first time inside a crowded foster center in New Haven and told her, "You do not need to earn love to deserve it." And Naomi still remembered the smell of Eleanor's lavender perfume that day. remembered how tightly the older white woman had held her hand during the drive home, while 6-year-old Naomi watched snow gather against the windows of a silver Mercedes she had been too nervous to touch. And even after all the years that followed, after boarding schools, piano lessons, charity dinners, and endless whispers from strangers wondering why a wealthy widow would adopt a black child into one of the oldest families in Connecticut, Eleanor Hawthorne had never once let Naomi feel unwanted inside those walls. But the world outside the mansion had always been different, because strangers saw skin before they saw humanity, and money before they saw kindness. And standing there now in the cold rain with water soaking through the sleeves of her coat, Naomi could feel those old memories pressing against her chest again like ghosts she had spent years trying not to carry. While 30 feet away, Daniel Brooks watched her with growing irritation as another taxi pulled up behind the line of luxury vehicles, forcing one of the valets to motion traffic around Naomi, standing near the gate. "Ma'am, I already told you," Daniel said sharply. "You are blocking the entrance." Naomi slowly bent down beside her suitcase and pulled out a worn leather folder protected carefully inside a plastic sleeve. The edges looked old, softened by time and travel. "I have identification," she said quietly. Daniel barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "Anybody can print papers." The younger guard beside him smirked under his breath. "This happens more than you think," he muttered. Naomi ignored the comment. Her eyes drifted upward toward the east wing windows glowing softly above the garden. Eleanor's room. The curtains were still the same cream color she remembered. A lump formed in her throat before she swallowed it down. Earlier that morning, Naomi had flown in from Atlanta on a delayed flight after spending the last 6 months settling Eleanor's medical affairs and legal paperwork alone, because despite all the Hawthorne money, very few people stayed close once sickness entered the picture, and Naomi had been the one sitting beside the hospital bed during the final nights, the one reading aloud from old poetry books while machines hummed softly in the dark, the one holding Eleanor's trembling hand when she whispered her final words. "Go home, Naomi. Not fight for the house. Not protect the inheritance. Just go home." That was why Naomi stood there now, carrying only a small suitcase and a framed photograph wrapped carefully beneath sweaters inside the luggage, because she had not come to prove anything to strangers in tuxedos. She had come home to grieve. Another burst of laughter floated from the mansion entrance as guests stepped beneath giant crystal chandeliers, while servers carried silver trays through the foyer. And Naomi noticed how several people near the valet line kept glancing toward her before quickly looking away the moment their eyes met hers. Like discomfort itself had become contagious. Daniel checked his watch impatiently. "Last warning," he said. "Either head to the service entrance or leave the property." Naomi looked at him calmly, exhaustion sitting deep behind her eyes now. "My mother is buried less than 2 miles from here," she said softly. "I am not leaving." For the first time all evening, Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not into sympathy, but annoyance, because in his mind grief did not change appearances, and appearances were the only thing he trusted. Daniel Brooks had spent most of his life believing that order was the same thing as respect, and standing beneath the stone archway of Hawthorne Mansion with rain gathering across the shoulders of his pressed uniform, he watched Naomi Carter the same way he watched every person who arrived at those gates, searching for signs of status before deciding how much dignity they deserved. Because long before he became head of security for one of the wealthiest estates in Connecticut, Daniel had learned that powerful people trusted appearances more than truth. And after 22 years in private security protecting executives, politicians, and old money families, he had built his entire reputation around controlling access, controlling perception, and never letting someone out of place embarrass the people paying his salary, which was why tonight mattered so much to him. Because the Hawthorne Foundation Gala was not just another charity event, but the largest gathering the estate had hosted since Eleanor Hawthorne's death, and wealthy investors, judges, surgeons, and business leaders filled the mansion behind him, drinking expensive wine beneath crystal chandeliers while reporters waited near the entrance hoping to photograph New England's elite arriving under the rain-soaked lights. And Daniel had spent the last week drilling every guard on presentation, posture, and image, reminding them repeatedly that one mistake could cost them contracts worth millions of dollars. But now this woman standing outside the gate with wet shoes and an old suitcase had become the only thing disrupting the perfect picture he wanted to protect. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," Daniel said, his voice growing colder as another black SUV rolled slowly past them toward the valet station. Naomi remained still beside her suitcase. Rainwater slid from her curls onto the collar of her coat, while distant piano music drifted from inside the mansion ballroom. "I only asked to go inside," she answered quietly. Daniel shook his head once. "No, ma'am. You claimed you live here." Nearby guests pretended not to stare, while continuing toward the entrance under large umbrellas held by attendants in white gloves. But Daniel noticed the sideways glances anyway, and embarrassment began tightening inside his chest because wealthy people hated visible discomfort, especially during charity events built around appearances of compassion. One older donor slowed beside the valet line and lowered his voice toward Daniel. "Everything all right here?" Daniel immediately straightened his posture. "Completely under control, sir." The donor gave Naomi one brief glance before nodding and continuing inside without another word. That look irritated Daniel more than he expected because he recognized it instantly. It was the look rich people gave when they believed staff had allowed something unpleasant too close to their evening. Daniel turned back toward Naomi. "Do you understand how private events work?" he asked. "You cannot just walk onto a property because you feel connected to it." Naomi looked at him carefully then, not with anger, but almost sadness. "Connected?" she repeated softly. "I learned how to ride a bicycle on this driveway." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Enough." He motioned toward the younger guard. "Check the guest list again." The younger man scrolled through a tablet for several seconds before shaking his head. "No Naomi Carter." Daniel exhaled through his nose like the answer settled everything. There it is. But what Daniel did not know was that Naomi's name would never appear on the guest list because the gala itself had been organized before the final transfer of ownership paperwork was completed 3 weeks earlier in Boston, and only 2 people in the entire state currently knew the truth about Eleanor Hawthorne's will: the family attorney and the estate manager, both still inside the mansion preparing documents Naomi had not even seen yet, while outside beneath the rain, the woman who legally owned every acre beyond those gates stood being treated like a trespasser by men protecting a house that no longer belonged to the people paying them. And still Naomi did not raise her voice because Eleanor Hawthorne had once told her something she never forgot. The easiest way to reveal someone's character is to give them power over a person they think cannot fight back. The rain grew heavier over Hawthorne Mansion, turning the long driveway into ribbons of reflected gold beneath the estate lights, while inside the ballroom a string quartet played softly for people who had never worried about being unwelcome anywhere in their lives. And outside the gates Naomi Carter stood motionless with damp curls pressed against her cheeks, as if the storm itself had decided to test how much humiliation one person could carry quietly before breaking. But Naomi had spent too many years learning how to survive uncomfortable rooms without losing her dignity to let strangers see pain on her face now, even while every memory attached to the mansion pulled at her chest harder with each passing minute. Because she remembered exactly what Eleanor Hawthorne used to say whenever reporters questioned why a wealthy white widow would leave her fortune to an adopted black daughter instead of distant blood relatives. "Character outlives blood," Eleanor would tell them calmly, and Naomi had believed those words every day of her life until tonight reminded her how quickly the world ignored humanity the moment appearance entered the conversation. Daniel Brooks stepped closer again, his polished shoes splashing lightly against the wet pavement. "I am done asking politely," he said. "You are disrupting a private event." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him. "I only need 5 minutes inside." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, there is something upstairs that belongs to my mother. Your mother did not live here." Naomi swallowed once before answering. "Yes, she did." Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose, the kind people make when they think someone is becoming unreasonable. Around them, more guests drifted toward the entrance beneath black umbrellas, while flashes from photographers occasionally lit the rain silver for a split second. Naomi noticed several people openly staring now. One woman wearing a diamond necklace slowed near the valet stand and whispered something to her husband while glancing toward Naomi's suitcase. The husband gave a small, uncomfortable shrug before guiding her inside. Nobody asked Naomi if she was all right. Nobody asked her name. To them, she had already become a problem before she became a person. Daniel motioned toward the younger security guard again. Escort her away from the entrance. The younger man hesitated slightly this time, perhaps noticing how calm Naomi remained despite everything. But Daniel's stare hardened enough to force obedience. "Ma'am," the younger guard said awkwardly. "There is a public sidewalk near the main road where you can wait." Naomi looked at him gently. "I am not trying to cause trouble." "Then help us out here," Daniel interrupted sharply. "Because right now you are making everyone uncomfortable." That sentence settled heavily in the cold air between them because Naomi had heard versions of it her entire life. In department stores where employees followed her too closely. In luxury hotels where staff assumed she worked there instead of staying there. In boardrooms where people complimented how articulate she sounded before asking who she assisted. And standing in front of the house where she once learned piano beside Eleanor Hawthorne. Hearing it again somehow hurt more than all the others combined. Naomi slowly knelt beside her suitcase and unzipped the front pocket carefully before pulling out a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Rainwater glistened across her fingers as she held it up quietly. "This opens the East Library," she said. "Eleanor gave it to me when I was 16. Daniel barely looked at the key before replying. "That does not prove anything." Naomi nodded faintly like she already expected the answer. "There is a photograph in the library fireplace room," she continued softly. "Eleanor standing beside a little girl wearing yellow rain boots. That girl is me." Daniel crossed his arms tighter. Anybody could know details from magazines or old interviews. Naomi stared at the mansion windows glowing through the storm. "The piano in the West Hall is missing one ivory key because I broke it when I was 11 and cried for 3 hours afterward." Daniel's patience finally snapped. "Enough stories." His voice rose just loud enough that nearby guests turned again. "This is not your house." For the first time all evening, Naomi's expression changed, not into anger, but heartbreak, so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the rain itself. And after several long seconds, she looked back at Daniel with eyes tired from grief more than humiliation before saying softly, "That is exactly what everyone said about me the first time Eleanor Hawthorne called me her daughter." For several seconds after Naomi spoke, the rain was the only thing moving in front of Hawthorne Mansion, falling steadily across the stone driveway and dripping from the iron gates, while warm laughter echoed faintly from inside the ballroom, like another world existing only a few feet away. And Daniel Brooks stared at her with the kind of expression people wear when they have already decided someone is lying before hearing the full story, because to him Naomi Carter did not match the image of inheritance, old money, or ownership. And the longer she remained standing there refusing to leave quietly, the more irritated he became by what he saw as defiance rather than grief. "You need to stop this right now," Daniel said firmly. "I am trying to be professional." Naomi looked at him with exhausted eyes. "So am I." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh and glanced toward the younger guard beside him. "Professional." He repeated the word under his breath as if it offended him. More guests were arriving now, and several had slowed openly near the entrance to watch the scene unfolding outside the gates. A valet attendant shifted awkwardly beside a silver Rolls-Royce, while photographers near the front stairs pretended not to pay attention, even though their cameras occasionally drifted toward Naomi standing alone in the rain, with soaked sleeves and trembling fingers wrapped around the handle of her suitcase. Then a woman in a white designer coat stepped beneath a large umbrella near the entrance and frowned openly at Naomi before leaning toward Daniel. "Is she homeless?" the woman asked quietly, though not quietly enough. Naomi heard every word. Daniel answered without lowering his voice. "We are handling it." The woman nodded with visible relief before disappearing inside the mansion. Naomi closed her eyes briefly after the doors shut behind her. Not because of the insult itself, but because Eleanor Hawthorne had spent 20 years trying to teach her that dignity could survive ignorance. And tonight Naomi was struggling to believe it. Daniel stepped closer again. "I need identification and proof you belong on this property." Naomi slowly handed him the leather folder she had protected from the rain. Daniel opened it carelessly beneath the security light, flipping through medical paperwork, travel documents, and legal letters too quickly to actually read them before stopping at a folded photograph tucked between the pages. He pulled it out. The picture showed a younger Eleanor Hawthorne smiling beside a teenage Naomi on the mansion steps during a summer garden party years earlier. Naomi's hair was braided neatly, and Eleanor's arm rested proudly around her shoulders. Daniel studied the photo for only a second before handing it back without emotion. Pictures do not prove ownership. Naomi carefully returned the photograph to the folder. I never said they did. Daniel's patience finally disappeared. Then what exactly are you trying to prove? Naomi looked toward the mansion windows glowing against the dark Connecticut sky. That my mother loved me enough to leave me a home. Daniel shook his head immediately. The Hawthorne estate does not belong to you. You keep saying that, Naomi answered softly. Because it is true. Daniel handed the folder back and motioned sharply toward the driveway entrance. This conversation is over. As Naomi reached to take the folder, the corner slipped against the rainwater covering Daniel's gloves and fell sideways onto the wet stone pavement. Papers scattered instantly beneath the wind. Medical. The rain finally softened into a cold, steady drizzle after most of the guests had disappeared inside Hawthorne Mansion, and for the first time all evening the driveway grew quieter, leaving behind only the distant sound of piano music floating through the ballroom windows and the soft rustle of wet trees swaying along the property line. While Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the stone entrance holding the leather folder tightly against her chest, as if protecting the last fragile pieces of a life nobody around her seemed willing to believe belonged there, and although her clothes were damp and her fingers numb from the cold, she remained composed with the same quiet dignity Eleanor Hawthorne had spent years teaching her through example rather than words, because Eleanor had always believed that grace revealed itself most clearly in moments when anger would have been easier. Daniel Brooks watched her from beneath the security awning with growing frustration. He had expected tears by now, or shouting, or the kind of emotional reaction that would justify removing her completely from the property without guilt. But Naomi continued standing there calmly beneath the rain, refusing to become the version of her that everyone seemed determined to create. One of the younger guards shifted uneasily beside Daniel before speaking under his breath. Maybe we should call estate management. Daniel immediately shook his head. At this hour? During the gala? She knows details about the house. Anybody can learn details online. The younger guard glanced toward Naomi again. She does not seem dangerous. Daniel's expression hardened. That is not the point. But deep down, even Daniel was beginning to feel something uncomfortable creeping beneath his certainty. Not because he believed Naomi yet, but because people lying for attention usually demanded to be heard. While Naomi spoke like someone carrying grief too heavy to waste energy proving herself to strangers. Near the front entrance, a waiter stepped outside briefly carrying empty champagne glasses on a silver tray before pausing when he noticed Naomi still standing there. Their eyes met for only a second before the waiter quietly slipped a folded white towel from beneath the tray and walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said gently, offering it to her. "You look freezing." Naomi accepted the towel with surprised gratitude. "Thank you." The waiter gave a small respectful nod before hurrying back inside without another word. Daniel noticed the exchange immediately and looked irritated again, not because of the towel itself, but because small acts of kindness had a way of making harsh behavior suddenly look uglier under bright lights. Naomi slowly dried rainwater from the photograph inside her folder before carefully placing it back between the documents. Her hands trembled slightly now, though whether from exhaustion or heartbreak, even she could not tell anymore. She looked once more toward the glowing east wing windows upstairs. Eleanor's room. The curtains were still open exactly the way she used to leave them at night. Naomi could almost picture her sitting beside the fireplace reading with a blanket across her lap, waiting for Naomi to come home from college breaks years ago, always smiling first before speaking. The memory hit, so suddenly Naomi had to close her eyes for a moment just to breathe through it. "You should leave before this gets worse," Daniel said finally, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Naomi lowered the towel slowly. "Worse for who?" Daniel did not answer immediately. The rain tapped softly against the security booth roof, while headlights from arriving cars reflected across the wet pavement in blurred gold streaks. Somewhere inside the mansion, guests laughed loudly at something unseen, and the sound felt strangely distant now. Naomi reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone carefully, staring at the dark screen for several seconds before unlocking it. Daniel noticed immediately. "Who are you calling?" Naomi looked at him quietly. "Someone who still remembers who I am." Then she stepped away from the gate toward the stone fountain near the driveway circle, where rainwater shimmered beneath soft garden lights. And sitting carefully along the edge with her suitcase beside her, Naomi pressed the phone to her ear while cold wind moved gently through the trees around the mansion that still did not recognize its owner waiting silently outside in the rain. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, and when Naomi Carter lowered the phone from her ear, she did not explain anything to the guards watching her from beneath the security awning because there was a calmness in her silence now that felt heavier than anger ever could. While rainwater rippled softly across the stone fountain beside her, and the lights from Hawthorne Mansion shimmered against the wet pavement like blurred memories refusing to disappear. And for several minutes, nothing seemed to change at all as guests continued drifting through the grand entrance laughing beneath umbrellas, while servers moved between ballroom doors carrying trays of champagne and polished silver. But then somewhere beyond the gates the low sound of an engine rolled through the darkness, deep and smooth enough to turn heads before the vehicle even appeared. Daniel Brooks straightened immediately when a black Bentley sedan approached the estate entrance faster than any other car that evening, its headlights cutting through the drizzle before stopping sharply beside the security booth. And the moment the rear door opened, the expression on Daniel's face shifted from irritation into surprise because the man stepping out into the rain was Arthur Whitmore, the Hawthorne estate manager for nearly 40 years, a man every employee on the property recognized instantly. Despite being in his 70s, Whitmore still carried himself with the quiet authority of someone trusted by generations of the Hawthorne family, his silver hair dampening beneath the rain as he closed the car door and looked toward the gate with visible urgency. "Mr. Whitmore," Daniel said quickly, stepping forward. "We have a situation under control." But Whitmore was no longer listening. His eyes had already found Naomi sitting beside the fountain with her soaked coat folded beside her suitcase. And the moment he saw her there alone in the rain, the color drained visibly from his face. "Miss Carter," he breathed softly, almost in disbelief. Naomi stood slowly as Whitmore hurried toward her across the wet stone driveway. "I am sorry to call so late," she said quietly. Whitmore looked horrified. "Call late?" His voice cracked slightly beneath the rain. "Good Lord, child, why are you outside?" Daniel stepped closer immediately. "Sir," she claimed to have ties to the property, but there was no authorization on the guest list. And guest list? Whitmore turned so sharply toward Daniel that even the younger guards froze where they stood. For the first time all evening, the old man's composure disappeared completely. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" Daniel hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "Sir," she refused to leave private property. Whitmore stared at him in stunned silence for one long second before looking back toward Naomi with heartbreak written across his face. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of his coat as he spoke again, this time quieter. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "why did nobody bring you inside?" Naomi glanced briefly toward Daniel before answering softly. There seemed to be confusion. The simplicity of her answer somehow made everything worse. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly like the weight of embarrassment physically hurt him, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a thick envelope protected carefully inside waterproof leather. "I was preparing these for tomorrow morning," he said. "I never imagined." His voice faded before he turned toward Daniel once more. Effective 3 weeks ago, Naomi Carter became sole legal owner of Hawthorne Mansion and all associated estate properties under Eleanor Hawthorne's final will. The rain seemed to disappear into silence after those words. Daniel did not move. The younger guard beside him looked stunned. Even several guests near the entrance had stopped walking completely. Whitmore handed the sealed documents carefully toward Naomi with both hands. "Everything is yours now, Miss Carter," he said quietly. "Mrs. Hawthorne made that very clear." Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His eyes moved from Naomi to the mansion behind her, and then back again like his mind could not force the image to make sense, because the woman he had spent the entire evening treating like an intruder had never once been trying to enter someone else's home at all. She had only been trying to come back to her own. For a long moment, nobody near the entrance of Hawthorne Mansion seemed capable of speaking, as if the rain itself had washed every confident assumption straight out of the night. and left only silence standing beneath the estate lights, while Daniel Brooks remained frozen beside the security gate, with water dripping slowly from the edge of his uniform jacket and the realization settling across his face piece by piece, heavier. Each second he replayed the entire evening in his mind. Every dismissive glance, every accusation, every moment he had looked at Naomi Carter and decided she could not possibly belong there, because she did not resemble the image of ownership he trusted. And now the truth stood directly in front of him, holding the legal documents proving she owned not only the mansion behind him, but the very ground beneath his polished shoes. Nearby guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations near the entrance faded into uncomfortable murmurs, while several people who had ignored Naomi earlier now stared openly at her with expressions shifting between embarrassment and disbelief. The woman in the white designer coat who had asked if Naomi was homeless lowered her eyes immediately the moment Naomi glanced in her direction. Arthur Whitmore stood quietly beside Naomi, his face still carrying visible shame over what had happened under his watch, even though he had arrived too late to stop it. "Miss Carter," Whitmore said softly, "please come inside. Mrs. Hawthorne would never forgive us for leaving you out here." Naomi looked down briefly at the rainwater glistening across the stone driveway before lifting her eyes toward the mansion again. For the first time all evening, she truly looked at it not as a memory, not as a place she feared losing, but as home returned to her in the middle of public humiliation, and somehow the victory did not feel triumphant the way people watching expected it to. It only felt sad. Daniel finally stepped forward slowly. "Miss Carter," his voice sounded smaller now, stripped of the authority he had worn like armor all night. Naomi turned toward him calmly. Rain tapped softly against the iron gates behind them, while distant music still floated from the ballroom windows. Daniel swallowed once before speaking again. "I owe you an apology." Naomi said nothing. Daniel glanced downward briefly, unable to hold her gaze for more than a few seconds at a time now. "I made assumptions," he admitted quietly. "I should have treated you with respect regardless." The younger guard beside him lowered his head as well, visibly uncomfortable. Naomi studied Daniel for a long moment, and what unsettled him most was that she did not look angry enough to punish him. She looked disappointed. "Do you know what hurt the most tonight?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head once. Naomi glanced toward the mansion entrance where wealthy guests still lingered awkwardly beneath the lights. "Not being stopped at the gate," she said. "Not even being doubted." Her eyes returned to his. "It was how easy it was for everyone to decide I did not belong before anyone asked my name." Daniel's expression tightened with quiet shame. Naomi looked down at the folded towel still resting over her suitcase, the one simple act of kindness someone had offered without knowing who she was. "A uniform should protect dignity," she continued gently, "not decide who deserves it." The words landed harder than anger ever could. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, as if something inside him had finally collapsed beneath the weight of recognition. For years he had believed professionalism meant controlling access, controlling appearance, controlling who entered spaces built for wealth and influence. But standing there in front of Naomi Carter, he understood for the first time how easily power became cruelty when empathy disappeared from it. Arthur Whitmore quietly signaled toward the younger guards near the gate, and within minutes radios crackled softly beneath the rain as instructions were passed through the security team. No shouting, no public humiliation, just quiet removal from duty before the night continued. Daniel understood immediately what it meant. He nodded once without arguing. Then, to Naomi's surprise, he removed the security badge from his jacket slowly and held it in both hands for a second before speaking one final time. "Mrs. Hawthorne was right to trust you with this house," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him carefully, then toward the glowing windows of the mansion where her mother's memory still lived in every hallway. "I did not come back here to punish people," she answered softly. "I came back because someone I loved wanted me to know I belonged." An hour later, the rain had finally stopped over Hawthorne Mansion, leaving the estate wrapped in the kind of quiet that only arrives after something important changes forever. While inside the ballroom, the charity gala continued more softly than before, conversations lowered by embarrassment and reflection as guests moved carefully beneath crystal chandeliers that suddenly seemed less dazzling than they had earlier that evening. Because wealth had a strange way of losing its shine once people were forced to confront the ugliness hiding beneath polished manners. And, through the massive windows overlooking the gardens, Naomi Carter walked slowly alone through the East Wing hallway carrying her small suitcase beside her, her footsteps echoing softly across marble floors she had once raced across as a child, while Eleanor Hawthorne laughed somewhere nearby, telling her not to slide in socks across expensive stone. And as Naomi passed framed family portraits lining the walls, she noticed for the first time that her own photograph still remained among them. Exactly where Eleanor had placed it years ago near the library staircase, untouched, unremoved, waiting quietly through every season she had spent away from home. The mansion smelled exactly the same as she remembered: cedarwood, old books, and the faint trace of Eleanor's favorite candles lingering somewhere deep inside the walls like memory refusing to fade completely. Staff members stepped aside respectfully when Naomi passed now, their expressions carrying gentleness instead of suspicion. But Naomi did not linger on any of their faces because tonight had exhausted something deeper than anger inside her. She climbed the curved staircase toward the east wing slowly, one hand trailing lightly along the polished railing while moonlight spilled through tall windows onto the floor in pale silver reflections. Somewhere downstairs a grandfather clock chimed softly, each note stretching through the quiet house, like a heartbeat finally slowing after a storm. When Naomi reached Eleanor's bedroom door, she paused before entering. The room remained almost exactly as it had the last time she visited months earlier. A folded blanket rested neatly at the edge of the bed. Reading glasses sat beside an unfinished novel near the fireplace chair. The curtains still framed the lake outside where rainwater shimmered beneath the moonlight. Naomi set her suitcase gently beside the doorway before crossing the room toward the fireplace mantel where dozens of photographs stood arranged in silver frames. Her eyes settled on one picture immediately, Eleanor smiling beside 6-year-old Naomi wearing bright yellow rain boots and holding a melting ice cream cone during a summer storm years ago. Naomi lifted the photograph carefully with both hands. The glass was cracked slightly across one corner from years of age, but Eleanor had never replaced it because she once told Naomi imperfections proved something had survived long enough to matter. Naomi sat quietly at the edge of the bed holding the frame against her chest while the silence of the room wrapped around her gently instead of painfully now. Down below in the driveway, black security vehicles slowly disappeared beyond the iron gates one by one beneath the fading mist of rainwater rising from the pavement. No shouting, no spectacle, just quiet consequences carried away into the night. Arthur Whitmore had already instructed the remaining staff to prepare the estate transfer meetings for the morning, but none of that mattered to Naomi right now. The money did not matter. The mansion itself barely mattered. What mattered was that Eleanor Hawthorne had seen her fully in a world determined not to, and even after death, that love had remained strong enough to bring her home. Naomi reached toward the bedside lamp and switched it off softly. Moonlight filled the room instead, pale and calm across the walls. She walked toward the window overlooking the long driveway where everything had begun hours earlier and rested her fingertips lightly against the cool glass. The gates stood closed again now, silent beneath the night sky, but this time they no longer looked like barriers. They looked like something finally opening from the inside. Behind Naomi, the old grandfather clock echoed faintly through the mansion once more, steady and patient, while outside the storm clouds drifted slowly away from the estate that had finally remembered who belonged there all along.